A magnificent ending. That's the way I would describe Assassin's Creed Revelations, a game that respects its protagonist and concludes the story of what could be argued is still to this date the best we've seen in the Assassin's Creed series. The game perfectly weaves together stories from Assassin's Creed 1, Assassin's Creed 2 and Brotherhood into a fine conclusion for not only Ezio but also Altair. This game really was Ubisoft's Phase 1 with Assassin's Creed and drew to a close an amazing sequence of games that have stood the test of time. And from Assassin's Creed 3 onwards, I don't think Ubisoft have been able to come close to interweaving character stories in such a unique way for such a fantastic payoff for the player at the game's conclusion, nor have they provided a character as compelling and complex as Ezio. I mean, take this final Ezio scene in Revelations.
I have lived my life as best I could, not knowing its purpose, but drawn forward like a moth to a distant moon. And here at last, I discover a strange truth. That I am only a conduit for a message that eludes my understanding. Who are we, who have been so blessed to share our stories like this? Speak across centuries.
It's still a masterpiece, and quite possibly one of my most cherished moments at the conclusion of a video game, as it still packs such an emotional punch. And after developing countless hours playing the Ezio trilogy, I've come to the opinion that this is arguably one of the finest trilogies starring the same protagonist that I've ever played. I'm struggling to think of anything better, with maybe the exception of the Arkham series coming very close. And Revelation stands alongside 2 and Brotherhood as its own title, and definitely deserves much more respect as a game. It's an incredibly underrated title, and I remember that it split opinions wildly at the time of its release, and was seen, and still is to some extent by some, as the lesser entry in the Ezio series. I think the game offers so much. A new environment outside of Italy to see, a smaller map to explore every detail of, which I don't think is an issue in an Assassin's Creed game. I mean, just look at recent releases in the series. And an older and darker take on our now ageing protagonist. When released in 2011, there was a general feeling that there wasn't a need for another Ezio game. The formula was becoming a little washed up, and there was a desire to re-energise and develop new stories, characters and mechanics. But revisiting the game 12 years later, you understand that the decision to bring Ezio back for one final swan song was something of a masterstroke, culminating in the 3 main characters across 4 games coming together to conclude a truly epic tale. But most importantly for me, as you probably guessed, the game provides the perfect send-off for Ezio Auditore da Firenze, which strikes home mostly for me. And as for the criticisms, whilst there is a strong case to be made for the lack of innovation in this game, it more than makes up for it with a well-written storyline which again heavily focuses on Ezio's final search for the answers both he and his father before him were seeking. And let's be honest, the game isn't perfect. I won't pretend it is. But this game, in my opinion, really was made for the Ezio purists. And it's also worth remembering that this game almost didn't exist. The original idea for the game was a title called Lost Legacy that would have Ezio return to Masyaf earlier than he did in Revelations to discover the origins of the Assassin Order. And it would have been released on DS, but was ultimately shelved and the story incorporated into what we now know as Revelations. It's the reason the map of Constantinople is smaller and why the game isn't as fleshed out in terms of a story when comparing it to 2 or Brotherhood. So we can certainly cut it a little more slack based on its rushed development cycle. So let's dive in. The game takes place in 1511 and the player takes on the role for the 3rd and final time of Ezio Auditore, who is now 50 years old. Ezio initially travels to the Assassin's former fortress in Masyaf to learn more about the secrets left behind by the legendary Altair, but finds Masyaf occupied by the Templars, who attempt to kill him. Ezio escapes and discovers the entrance to an underground library built by Altair, which requires 5 keys to unlock. The Templars have already found one underneath the Ottoman Sultan's palace and are searching for the remaining keys in Constantinople. Travelling there, Ezio is met by Yusuf Tazim, leader of the Ottoman assassins, and befriends the young student Suleiman. Ezio soon learns that the keys were hidden by Niccolo Polo and meets Sofia Sartor, an Italian traveller and collector. Ezio finds the keys with Sofia's help, while developing feelings for her which grow throughout the progression of the game. The game's story is divided into two main parts: Ezio's adventures in Constantinople, where he attempts to collect the 5 Masyaf keys to open Altair's library, and Ezio's exploration of Altair's 5 memories, which are stored within the keys. Within these memories, he learns that Altair, after killing his traitorous mentor, Al-Mulaim, took over and tried to reform the assassins, but was challenged by a former friend, Abbas Sofyan. While Altair and his wife Maria were away fighting the Mongol invasion, Abbas staged a coup, seizing control of the assassins and executing Altair's youngest son, Seth. Altair sought revenge, but Maria had tried to stop him, leading to her being killed in the crossfire, and Altair subsequently forced into a self-imposed exile. But he eventually returns to kill Abbas and reclaim leadership of the assassins. Years later, Altair encoded his memories on the keys before entrusting them to Niccolo Polo. In Constantinople, Ezio is caught up in a power struggle between the Ottoman Sultan and the Byzantine Templars, who are seeking the Apple of Eden, which they believe is hidden in Altair's library. Ultimately, Ezio overcomes the Templars, who it is revealed are led by Suleiman's brother Ahmet, who kills Yusuf and takes Sofia prisoner, demanding the keys for her safe return. Ezio naturally saves the damsel in distress and then pursues Ahmet to recover the keys. While Ahmet is killed by Selim, now the Sultan, Ezio is spared due to Suleiman's endorsement, but is ordered to leave Constantinople and never return. The game concludes with Ezio entering the library to find the skeleton of Altair and the Apple of Eden, which Ezio refuses, stating, "I've seen enough for one life." Honestly, if you haven't played this game or simply don't remember this scene from the game, go replay it or rewatch it. It's truly remarkable. And the story is certainly not as strong as previous games. There's no real visible antagonist as you progress through the game. I personally struggle to remember some of the missions that I undertook, and I don't think the game is supposed to be an all-out action thriller like Assassin's Creed 2 or Brotherhood. I think for me, it's more a journey of wisdom and discovery for Ezio. I mean, he actually states himself in the opening scene of the game.
When I first set out from Roma 10 months ago, I did so with a single purpose: to discover what our father did not. In a letter written the year before my birth, he makes mention of a library hidden beneath the stones of Masyaf Castle. A sanctum full of invaluable wisdom.
This is an indicator that the game, for me, is going to follow a very different trajectory than the previous two, and that leads us quite nicely into Ezio's character. The game does such an incredible service to Ezio's character, and the game will be ranked highly by those who have invested in this story over the previous two games, as it brings his character arc to a close in such a beautiful way. Ezio, now 50 years old and has achieved almost mythical status within the Assassin's Order. His introduction to Yusuf highlights this. And Ezio is still seeking the answer to the question that has stuck with him since the death of his father and his 2 brothers, which is, what is all this for? That is the ultimate answer he pursues throughout his quest, and even now in his latter years, he is still searching for that answer. Ezio attempts to uncover yet another Templar plot to overthrow the established order in Constantinople, and it's refreshing to play as him in a setting away from Italy. The game has a much darker, more brooding feeling to it compared to the previous 2 Ezio entries. The colours used to depict Constantinople are darker. Ezio's assassin's attire is also a darker colour palette than we have been used to. And Ezio himself as a character is also darker. His kills are more brutal. He's become much more ruthless as an assassin, and he's become the wise master of the assassins with a now global reputation. The grind of honouring the lives and legacies of his father and 2 brothers are now weighing heavy on him, and we're introduced to a very, very different Ezio. And I believe this is what could be the reason that people sort of were reserved or potentially just didn't like certain aspects of Revelations, because they're playing as an older Ezio, a darker Ezio. Especially if you've recently played Assassin's Creed 2 or Brotherhood, starting Revelations can be a bit of a shock. Ultimately, the story of Ezio ends in this game with him realising that the knowledge and answers he has been seeking are so much bigger than he can ever attempt to understand in his lifetime. His realisation that he was a conduit for something much larger is still such an epic scene. But it also bristles with a sadness that he will never be able to fully complete his father's work. But Ezio himself also decides that it's time for him to move on from the memory of his family and to ultimately live for himself. I think this scene right here is possibly one of the most underrated in terms of dialogue, not only within this game, but also within the actual 3 Ezio games that we play.
For 3 decades, I have served the memory of my father and my brothers, and fought for those who have suffered the pain of injustice. I do not regret those years, but it is time to live for myself and let them go. Let go of all of this.
Then let go. You will not fall far.
His character is treated with the utmost respect and is given a send-off worthy of such a strong protagonist, and one that so many of us have come to love. And a really important point here is that he finds a partner in Sofia. I think his blossoming relationship with her is handled so well throughout the game, and it's such a vital part of Ezio's overall character development. Whilst he's shown to be darker and ruthless, we realise that deep down he still yearns for that connection, for that soulmate. And as the game draws to a close, with him retiring to begin his life with Sofia, we really feel that sort of full circle of his overall development in terms of his relationship. This hit pretty well for me, especially considering his relationships with Cristina Vespucci and Caterina Sforza had ended in such abrupt and often sad circumstances for Ezio. And now, whilst I'm aware this man is pixelated, it's wonderful to see the character rounded off and completed in such a compassionate and understanding way. The developers clearly loved him and his story, and you sense that really as a player as you realise that this story arc is something that has been deeply considered and executed as well as possibly could be. Revelations also features a rich yet smaller map in Constantinople. It's certainly a change from Rome or Florence in terms of the scope and the size of the map, but it still provides a vibrant and bustling city with sprawling markets, ornate mosques and winding alleyways. It certainly feels as though it's missing key points of interest at times. I mean, you compare this to Assassin's Creed 2 or Brotherhood, where you have the Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore or the Colosseum in Rome. I don't think you really have this in Revelation, so it might seem like a bit more of a forgettable map in comparison. I am thinking of the Grand Bazaar here, which was quite an interesting addition, but didn't really have that level of interest and sort of magnificence as the 2 former examples that I mentioned. And I said this previously, that Constantinople is definitely a little more drab in terms of the overall colour of the city. It's pretty much a variation of greys, but personally I enjoy it. It's a darker feel, and the colour choice symbolises a city at war with itself, as the Byzantines and Ottomans fight for power in what is one of the world's oldest and most famous cities. The buildings are closer together, making it more like the experience of Florence in Assassin's Creed 2, because it allowed you the ability to free run over rooftops at speed without having to stop and reassess your overall route to your destination like you had to in Brotherhood. Now, I know that will be a point of contention for some, but honestly, I love the ability to free run all the way from point A to point B, sometimes as mindlessly as possible, taking in the sights and well-crafted city from a bird's eye view. It's a nice change to move away from the Renaissance design of Italy as well, towards the split of European and Asian design of Constantinople. Seeing and experiencing a new location within the game is always welcomed, and there was definitely a need to move away from Italy at this stage in the franchise, with the 2 previous games being based there. The game also provides some enhanced gameplay mechanics as well. For one, there is the Hook Blade, a tool that allows the player to zip line across gaps and climb buildings faster. The Hook Blade could also be used to perform new combat moves as well, such as the Hook and Throw maneuver, which allows the player to grab an enemy and throw them into another player. One thing I would say about the hook blade was that you weren't really able to use it as much. There was few and far between ropes or lines or whatever they were supposed to be called between buildings, so using it on a regular basis wasn't really a possibility. And it was also a shame that this mechanic was never really added into any other future game, so it was a bit of a strange one, really, to say the least. The game also featured a new crafting system that allowed the player to craft bombs with different effects, such as a smoke bomb. The bombs could be used for various purposes, such as distracting enemies and creating diversions. Again, on a personal level, the bombs were a bit of a strange addition for me. They often had varying strengths, to be quite honest. They were a little bit hit and miss in terms of how powerful and effective they were when used. And I would be honest to say that this wasn't a feature that I used an awful lot, but I could certainly see the potential here for the mechanics to be used long term. Finally, the game also included the tower defense game called Den Defense. In this mode, the player must defend their captured territories from enemy attacks by placing units and traps strategically. Honestly, I played it once and I didn't play it again. I couldn't get into it, but it's a nice to have option. And I'm just going to interject here as well, just to mention something else about the gameplay. I realise I've been a little bit negative about it, but I think it just comes from the fact that I never really used any of these additional features, to be totally honest, with maybe the exception of the hook blade, which already just seemed like a slightly enhanced jump feature, which we already really had in Assassin's Creed 2, when Ezio learns the ability to essentially sort of double jump. Some of these features, whilst, like I said, interesting, I don't really think they added anything of really additional value to the game. They're just more nice to haves, and I would probably say this is a bit more of a negative, and it probably lends itself a little bit more to the argument that there should have been more innovations within the game, and I do find that something that's really, really difficult to argue with. The game, within respects to the mechanics, certainly could have been evolved a little further to really change the overall experience for the player, but considering the fact that this was a bit more of a rushed title in terms of its development cycle, considering it was originally lost legacy for DS, it can be forgiven for that. And I think a lot of the time was really spent into scripting a quite wonderful narrative for Ezio. There have been many times throughout writing my thoughts on this game where I've said to myself, what were the core missions? How did they impact the overall story as I've progressed through this game? And honestly, it's actually quite hard to answer this. And the more that I thought about it, the more that I've realised that it's down to a strong bias to the character and the respect that I have for really closing out Ezio's story, which I enjoyed the most when playing this game. When I play games, I'm driven by a narrative and the strength of the character that we get to explore and learn more about as their story unfolds in the crafted world around us. While some of the missions in Revelations are pretty forgettable, it's the strength of the overall story of Ezio and being able to conclude that in the game. And that's why it ranks so highly for me. He is the assassin I think of when people mention the Assassin's Creed games. He's the gold standard in a character's overall development, and it was a privilege to play 3 games where I got to play as a character from birth until death. Playing the Ezio trilogy has reconfirmed that these games are still stellar titles. Playing them on new hardware enhances what is already a wonderful gaming experience, and the narrative is stronger than anything that has preceded it in the Assassin's Creed universe. Thanks for listening. If you've enjoyed some of the recent content, then feel free to jump into the comments and suggest what you'd like to see next. I read all of the comments and I'm keen to see what you, the viewers, want to see and hear from me. Thanks for listening again, and I'll see you in the next one.